Hello there, everyone, and welcome to One Idea Away. I've been looking forward to today's conversation. I think, as you know, we hit this theme, this topic around connection quite often. And actually, I want to step back and introduce it a little bit differently today. It's that, very recently I've had conversations in some workshops that I've been at, some client work that I've done, and just generally some, connecting with individuals that come to this show and tune in as well. And there seems to be this sense that we're not quite in alignment with who we really truly are in our lives and in our work, meaning that people have this sense, this feeling that things are just a bit off. Things are a bit harder than they need to be. They don't seem to be as much fun or as enjoyable as they used to be, that maybe life just doesn't have quite that energy or that zest or even a little bit of that passion and purpose that we thought it would at this point. And I think we're going to have a lot of fun diving into this conversation and into the depth of it, because one of the ways we talk about it, one of those famous words that's out there and used all over right now is authenticity. But what does it really mean to live an authentic life? Well, to answer that, we've got to go on a conscious exploration, because so much of the way that we live and so much of what we may say is authentic to who we are, those are actually just kind of the ways that we've learned to live life. They're the ways that we've learned to show up. It's the stories that we tell ourselves. So we've got to do a bit of peeling back and looking beneath those stories to uncover who we really are, right at the very core, the essence of who we are. So we can then discover, how do we bring that out again? How do we let that emerge so it's showing up in whatever we do in life? Doesn't matter whether it's work or relationships or communication or with our kids or whatever. We want that to be able to emerge. We want to be able to have that part of ourselves be seen and be felt. And so we're going to dive into that today with a very special guest. I've actually had the chance of interviewing and connecting with HeatherAsh Amara before. And this is our chance with some of her newest work, which aligns perfectly, I guess pun intended there on alignment, aligns perfectly with where we're going to be going today. And so let me properly introduce HeatherAsh Amara. Is the author of The Warrior Heart Practice, as well as many other books like The Warrior Goddess Training, the little book on Big Freedom, Warrior Goddess Way, Awaken Your Inner Fire. She's also the co-author of other books like The 7 Secrets to Happy, Healthy Relationships with Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. She is dedicated to inspiring depth, creativity, and joy by sharing the most potent tools from a variety of world traditions. HeatherAsh studied and taught extensively with Don Miguel Ruiz. If you're not familiar with Don Miguel, one of his most famous books is The 4 Agreements, among many, many, many other books that he has written. And she continues to teach with the Ruiz family today. She was raised in Southeast Asia, has traveled the world since childhood, and is continually inspired by the diversity and the beauty of human expression and experience that she comes across. She brings to our conversation today, as well as to the world, a very open-hearted and inclusive perspective. She's trained in the Toltec wisdom tradition, as well as European shamanism, Buddhism, and Native American ceremony. And with that, HeatherAsh, thank you so much for joining us here on One Idea Away.
Thanks so much. So good to be back with you again, Luke.
Thank you. And today we're going to get into a lot of things, everybody. We're going to talk, a bit about how do we get disconnected, meaning what is it that takes us a bit off path. We're going to talk about how is it that we remember to reconnect, and what is it that we're actually reconnecting to. We're going to talk about this specific warrior heart process, the 4 chambers stages that we move through, because I think it breaks through this process of how we reconnect extremely, extremely well. And then how do we integrate? Meaning, it's one thing to have the insights, but how do we actually bring that to bear and let that reemerge inside of our lives? And so I guess, HeatherAsh, as we turn to that and turn to this conversation, we got a big conversation today to get into. I think maybe the best place to begin is just to talk a little bit about your journey to this work. Because obviously this is not something that you just kind of stumble across and say, oh, here's my life work. There's probably a story, there's a journey that leads you to this. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that path.
Yeah, I'd say my journey really started young, being raised in Asia and just seeing people really connected. And I didn't have the language for it, but I just remember when I moved to the States to go to college, I had this feeling sense of like, something is not right here. I felt disconnected myself. I felt like people around me were disconnected. And again, I didn't exactly have the language, but I had a feeling sense in my body. And my real desire was like, I need to go back to Asia. I need to go back to my people. But I got really big into politics, and that's where I started to try and find that sense of connection. And a couple of years into that, I realized I'm angry, all my friends are angry, and nothing's changing. And so I said, okay, this is not it. There's something I need to adjust. And that's when I started looking at different spiritual traditions and studied with a lot of different teachers. I was really blessed with some incredible mentors. And about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years into that journey, I had a dream about somebody who's going to change my life. And I remember waking up from that dream going, right, where am I going to meet this person? I live in a tiny town in Northern California. And a week later, someone came into my office and said, oh my God, you have to meet this man. And my whole body went, oh no, like I knew he had arrived and I wasn't ready. And it took me a year to get ready. I knew that there was going to be a huge change in my life. And that man was Don Miguel Ruiz. And I met him before there was a book. There was no 4 Agreements. And it was an incredible time of really deep study with him. And so my work now is a blend of European shamanism wisdom, which is about the cycles and the seasons and how to reconnect to the whole, as well as the wisdom of the Toltec.
Excellent. You mentioned when that friend walks in and says, you've got to meet this guy. And you said it took you a year because you weren't quite ready. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, what that year was in kind of getting ready for the ride that you were then going to go on?
Yeah, I was teaching at the time in European shamanism. And so I was a teacher and sharing a particular path, basically. And what I understood was that was going to change drastically. I don't know how I knew that. I just knew that my identity, like who I had created myself to be, was going to get questioned. And so that year for me was really, in a way, saying goodbye to what I had known and really loving what I was doing, and also realizing this is finite. The form of this is finite. And it just took me that long to feel like, okay, I'm ready for whatever change is coming.
That's interesting, because you even describe a little bit of the kind of the European shamanism and some of the background there as seasons and cycles. And then what you just described, right, is part of that cycle, which many of us actually don't give ourselves time to go through, which is the transition, the winter, the grieving cycle, even leaving something behind. So we're preparing for what is actually then going to come next. Most of us don't give ourselves that time.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really true. And it's such an important part of the cycle to let go thoroughly and to be able to integrate the gifts from the past as you also let go and step into something new. We always want to let's birth the next thing, quick, birth the next thing. And which is beautiful. But if you're going to birth something really well, clean up the past first.
Yeah. And I do actually want to talk a little bit about those cycles just for a moment in a second, but there's a question I've just simply got to ask. How do you go from politics to European shamanism? There's something missing there for me.
That's such a good question. It really was that sense that I was really passionate about what I wanted to have happen, which is change, to help bring about change in the world. And so that part didn't change inside of myself. I still wanted to create transformation. I just realized how I was going about the transformation wasn't working. And so that's when I started really exploring what's the foundation, what's underneath everything. And I realized for me, that was what people's spirit, how we connect to ourselves. I was doing outward, and I realized I needed to balance it by going inward. And what I've learned, and I really knew at the time as well, is that I'll come back to politics, I'll come back to social justice work and equality work, but I needed to come from a place of love.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'll probably mess the exact wording of this up, but I remember that kind of that old phrase of the young, smart, ambitious man went out to change the world. He became wise and recognized to come home and change himself first. Right. And it's interesting to me the number of individuals that get into whether it be politics, social policy, social justice. So some of these incredible causes that really truly tend to stem from something that is very, very heart-based. And yet at times it's more focused on the system, on the policies and whatnot. and we actually forget the kind of the humanity that it needs to begin with. And that's actually at the heart, again, pun intended, with the work that we're talking about here today. But it very much begins at home, so to speak, within the heart. So today, actually, I did want to ask about the seasons just real quick, or make a comment and just see if you had anything to add to this before we shift into the kind of the process here. I think it's interesting how almost out of touch at times we can be with the different cycles of our life and the seasons of our life, right? That it seems like at times we don't pause long enough to recognize there's a rhythm to where we are in different aspects of our life. And instead we're trying to create change, and we're not in a season of change, or we are in a season of change and we're trying to hold on to it because we don't want it to change, right?
Yes.
And I'm just kind of curious if, what feedback or comments you may want to add to that, because that to me is an interesting place to enter this dialogue from.
Yeah, it's really critical. And if we look at the seasons, a great place to look at this is just, if you look at spring, summer, fall, winter, that, and a lot of places don't have 4 seasons, but we all know about the 4 seasons. And that you don't have a beautiful spring unless winter has allowed the underground processes to happen. Yeah. And so often in our culture, we're geared towards spring and summer, the birthing and the expression. And we're not so much around fall, which is the letting go and the releasing, and the winter, which is really stillness and going into the darkness. We try to avoid that part of the cycle. Yeah. And it really robs us of our life, of our passion, of our creativity, because we have to slow down to really come back to ourselves, to make sure, am I on the right path? Does this feel right in my body? How do I integrate what happened? I have an experience in my own life. This new book just came out. I've been working on it for 6 years, this huge birth process. And afterwards I felt really flat, and I was like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I have no passion. Like, I've just put all this energy. And my agent called me. She's like, hey, do you have postpartum depression? And I was like, right. Yes, that's what's happening. Yeah. Of course, there's all this energy towards something, and then you birth it, and then you're like, what do I do now, basically? Yeah. And it was like 2 days after I recognized where I was in the cycle of, I needed to rest, I needed to integrate, I actually needed to do nothing. Yeah. But I'd been so much in that, like, I've got to birth it, all the energy. And 2 days after I got that information, I put myself back in the cycle. I realized I was in exactly the right place. Boom, I feel ready again. Mm-hmm. And I could have kept myself in that in-between place by not honoring the cycle and trying to move on without stopping and slowing down. So it's really critical.
Yeah, it really is amazing that when we do create that bit of pause and step back so we can reflect of where we are in the cycles, it's amazing how much more seems to make sense in those moments, right? Yes, total gaining perspective of where things actually are. You used an interesting phrase in there of coming back to ourselves. And I guess maybe the starting point for where I want to go with the rest of this conversation is, where did we go? Right? Where did we, if we got to come back to ourselves, where have we been?
Where were we? Yeah.
Where were we?
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you could talk a bit about
that. So often where we live is in our head, and is in a fantasy world, basically, of what we think is supposed to be happening, what we think things should look like, who we think we're supposed to be. And so we're not actually present in our body with what's actually happening here. We're thinking about, it should look like this, I should be here. And that's the disconnect. So I really see that so often we abandon ourselves. We abandon ourselves by comparing ourselves to others, comparing ourselves to the image of perfection of who we think we're supposed to be at the time, comparing ourselves to who we were in the past. I mean, we're experts at comparing often. And that is a form of really deep disconnect, because we're not present with, who am I now? What's going on in my being now? What do I need now? We can't ask ourselves those questions.
Yeah. And it's cumulative, right? In the sense that we've got all of these different experiences where we are effectively maybe abandoning something that's truer for ourselves. We're disconnecting in some capacity. And, whether we use the phrase of we're forming certain beliefs or we're forming agreements, in more of Don Miguel Ruiz's, kind of background and vernacular, is that we're accumulating all of these different agreements, which become kind of the the shoulds in our lives. We should do this. We should be this. We should compare ourselves to that. And before we know it, we're living according to those rules, as opposed to ones that are probably a lot truer and more innate within who we are.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And there's often these external rules that we take on, these agreements that we take on from our parents, from our peers, from our religion, a lot of which we don't even realize are rules or agreements. We just think this is the way reality is.
Yeah.
So
why do we do that?
Start learning how to question.
Yeah. Why do we do that? Why do we, it's almost as if there's a part of us that we know is kind of this incredible wisdom. I guess I'm always amazed by the fact that when you connect somebody back into their inner voice, that inner wisdom that's there, it's like, well, wait a minute, I've always known this.
Yes, exactly.
Yet, right. And yet there's a part of us at some point that ignores that and trusts something outside of ourselves as opposed to something inside of ourselves. And I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about why we kind of wander away and get lost in these other expectations.
Yeah, it's really because we're trying to make sense of the world. One of the things about our brains is our brains love being right. We would rather, Miguel used to ask us all the time, would you rather be right or happy? In the beginning, I was like, right, I want to be right. Then I realized, oh, happy, who cares? Yeah. So in the way that I see it, and I learned this from Miguel, it's a really beautiful way to map, to look at the big picture view, is that each of us has what we call a big soul and a little soul. And your big soul is the part of you that's deeply connected, that's open, that understands that everything is connected, that we're not separate. Your big soul doesn't compare you to who you should be. Your big soul is like, this is good. Yeah. And then there's a part of us that's called our little soul. And this is super simple, but the little soul is the part of us that's our personality, our ego, our sense of separation. And that part of us is important. So it's not that it's a bad thing. It's part of the human experience. But what happens is that when we're little, those two parts of us are talking and they're deeply connected. And so you see this in little kids. If you see kids 2 or younger, it's usually before language, that they're just completely exuberant and joyful and present and loving. And if they don't like something, like, nope. They don't have a whole big reason, story why. They're just, that doesn't feel good. Yeah. And that's our innate nature. That's what we're working to get back to, is that same exuberance and play and curiosity around the world. Mm. But as we start to learn language, as we start to learn who we're supposed to be, and depending on how we were raised, like all of us, there's a dream that we're raised in of how we fit in, basically. Mm. And again, not a bad thing, but often we start using it against ourselves. And so the little soul, how I see it, is it gets lost. And if you think about a little kid that gets lost in a marketplace and how just intense you would feel if you were young and you couldn't find your parents and you didn't know what to do. And then you started thinking, oh my God, I have to figure this all out. And that's what a lot of us end up like, is that feeling sense of, I don't know how to do this, but I have to figure it out. And how we figure it out is by looking at the people around us, who they are, or rebelling against the people around us, which is also not our authentic self. But we create this whole dream of who we're supposed to be that feels like it's protecting us, that feels like it keeps us safe. But what it really does is keeps us in a box.
Yeah, that's interesting. I love that perspective of, being almost the child separated from parent, and then thinking, well, I have to go figure this all out now. Like I'm on my own. I gotta put all these pieces back together again. Because that certainly, I think, is a wonderful connection to what's usually going on in our minds. Of, we have to figure this all out. We gotta. It's all gotta make sense. And once it all makes sense, then everything is back together again. Yes. And ironically, that's, when we go looking for the missing pieces, all we're ever going to find are the missing pieces. Right. And so I guess that begins to, as how we begin to reconnect. And I want to step into that process, because there are specific chambers, stages that you walk us through that I think are a big piece of letting go and letting those pieces actually start to fall to the side. But we need to know how to do that. I want to walk through that. But just before we do, you specifically refer to this as the warrior heart process.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if
Mhm.
you could just explain a little bit more of what you really mean by warrior heart.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in many spiritual traditions, this idea of warrior is about absolute focus, commitment, presence on your path. So it isn't that you're battling the outside. What the battle is for your own attention, to bring your attention here, to do your own healing work, to start to untangle the stories, basically. And so we need the warrior quality of, I'm here, I'm committed, I can do this. Courage, it really is courage, because this work of dismantling our belief system is, it can be scary because you're letting go of the identity that was familiar.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the warrior comes in. We also need to balance the warrior energy with the heart, with the compassion, with our presence from that creative place.
Mm-hmm.
And to get out of the mind and start gearing ourselves from the wisdom of our heart, the wisdom of our bellies, we can say too. And I see those two centers are really connected.
Mm-hmm.
So the compassion of the heart connected with the courage of the warrior is what I'm working to bring to people, to help people to discover those qualities in themselves or grow them in themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting, and this may not be true for everyone, but when I think of, some of those role models, those mentors in my own life that have stood out the most, there is that incredible blend of the warrior, meaning that presence to their path, the discipline and the courage that goes
Yes.
into that, the strength that goes into that, and they were individuals that possessed extraordinary warmth and
Mhm.
compassion and humility. And you were
Yes.
able to connect to them in a very, very different way. So it wasn't overbearing. It wasn't dominant by any measure, but it was just this calm, quiet, confident peace that just exuded from them. And for everybody, if you haven't directly had that, you may want to take a look around to see who is it that may model that type of presence, that type of energy to you, just to give you a frame of reference. It can be very helpful when you can contextualize some of this. So with that, you talk about, as we begin then this path to connection, there were two different kind of paths that you labeled out. One was doing more of what you love. And then the other side of that is, how do we clear out all of the
Mhm.
things that kind of, add to the self-judgment and criticism and doubt and comparison mind that we run ourselves into. And so as we kind of navigate there, talk a little bit about doing what you love first, because that's a little more fun. And then we'll get
Yeah.
to the other path that takes a little more effort.
Cleaning. Yeah, exactly. In order to connect back with the big soul, one of the ways that we can do that is doing more things that bring us joy, that open our hearts, that we love, that we feel like when you do it, you get lost. That's the little soul reconnecting with the big soul. Because in those moments, you feel expanded, you feel joyful, you feel like anything's possible, and you're immersed in an experience. And so, more of what you love, whatever that is. So, it may be collecting stamps, it may be running, it may be dancing, it may be sitting in nature. Do more of what you love. And that sounds so simple, but it actually can be very challenging for us modern busy people, because we think, well,
Mhm.
let me get through my list and then I'll do more of what I love.
Yeah.
And I say, do more of what you love, and your list will become much clearer. You'll
Yeah.
get through your list in a different way.
Mhm.
So
It's
flip
interesting
that.
because, yeah, it's interesting how much we wrestle with that, because just, certainly we take on the stories of, but I need to do this, and here's my responsibilities, and here's my obligations, and then somewhere at the end of my week or 10 years from now, I'll get to the things that
Yes.
I actually love. And yet at the same time, when we talk to people that are burning out, that feel misaligned, that feel like they're kind of at the end of their rope, they're literally not touching anything that they love anymore. And
Yes.
so we've
Yes.
got to reconnect to these pieces.
Yes.
Aside from the work we're about to describe, we've got to reconnect to these pieces, because they fuel us. They expand us, was a great phrase that you described. They expand us, as opposed to tuning out, numbing out, disconnecting, and perpetuating that cycle, which is one of the other habits of distraction that we have
Yeah.
inside of our society at this point. So
Yes.
let's dive into the warrior heart process. You talk specifically about 4 chambers, and if we could step through these, I guess maybe actually describe the process maybe as a whole, just so people have the
Mhm.
context, and then we'll kind of go through and walk through just these chambers specifically, because I think each one of these are specific elements, not just part of process, but part of realization.
Yeah, absolutely. So the process is really simple, and it's based on the four chambers of the heart. And just like with your heart, you don't go, I like my left ventricle the best. That's the best part of my heart. You know, the heart is a unit and it all works together. And it's the same thing with the warrior heart practice. So the four chambers, just really briefly, are the feeling chamber. What am I feeling? The story chamber. What's the story that I'm telling myself? The truth chamber, what's actually true here, and the intent chamber, what do I want? Where do I want to put my energy? And then you go back through the process. And I think about the warrior heart practice, it's a cleaning practice, it's an inquiry practice, which helps you become more intimate with yourself, get to know yourself better, untangle things. And it's like, for many of us, we're like engines. And if you have an engine that's gotten gunky and it's not running really well, maybe it's not running at all, but it's like clunking along. In order to fix the engine, all you do is you take the engine apart, you clean the pieces, and you put it back together again. And so often we're like, the engine's bad, just throw it out with ourselves, right? Something's broken here, something's not right, I need a new thing. It's like, no, you just need to take the pieces apart, clean the pieces, bring the pieces back together again, and then you will be in alignment, basically. Then you'll be connected again. And so that's the practice, is take things apart, clean these areas, bring it back into the whole.
So that's I love the frame of this, and I'm just want to reiterate a bit of this for the importance of it. When we get out of alignment, if we feel that something is off, if we feel like we're upset, disappointed, or something is astray, it is very common for us as individuals to get very overwhelmed because we've never learned how to pick it apart. And that word of entangled is it seems so entangled. Well, is it an emotion? Is it a thought? Is it a belief? Is it this? Is it that? Is it what that person said? Whatever the case may be, right? We've got all this information that's coming at us from all these different directions, and it gets really, really entangled. And what you're describing, and I talked about it as conscious exploration when we opened the show. You just used it as inquiry. This is a way of a line of inquiry that helps you to disentangle the different pieces that are there and actually start to make sense of it in a more objective, whole space, so that it does not take you over. And it becomes a very, very empowering process because you can see more clearly at those moments. So that first chamber that you talk about is the feeling chamber. And, I let me kind of just add this perspective in. To me, when I started to walk through your process and what was here, it made such sense in looking at the context of beginning with feeling, because that's usually one of the things that has us really, really stirred up. And we're not great at letting it settle, as it were. And so I was wondering if you could then elaborate on the feeling chamber and what we're really looking to accomplish with this first step of inquiry.
Absolutely. So anytime you're confused, triggered, upset, feel out of balance, we start with that simple question, what am I feeling? But what's different from how we usually might ask ourselves that, or go, be with the feelings, is that you're learning to separate out the feeling from the story and just be with your feelings. So the truth is, most of us, we've gotten our feelings and our stories really tangled together. And so to untangle, what we learn how to do, you have to train yourself to do this, is to ask, what am I feeling now? Where is it in my body? So that you might go, okay, I've got grief. The grief feels like pressure in my chest. Just let me breathe into it. You're not trying to fix the feeling. You're not trying to understand the feeling. You're not trying to change it. You're just sitting with it. And sitting with it with your presence, with your love, with your compassion. Hello, there's a feeling. And it's so freeing when you learn how to do this, because most of us spend, probably 80% of our energy literally trying to avoid our feelings or trying to manage our feelings, rather than just being with them and learning to honor the feelings and clear up the past.
Mm-hmm. I think you say this really well in your words and in the book, of that struggle that we have with discomfort, right? It's that, many, obviously it's great to do this process when you're feeling joy, but let's be honest, we're usually doing this because we feel disappointed in something, right?
Yes. Yeah,
And so
exactly.
we've learned as a society, and I mean, you can see this in so many different elements of society, from healthcare to entertainment and
Yeah.
everything in between. We seek to distract ourselves from anything that feels uncomfortable because we want to get back to that place of safety and that comfort. And unfortunately, it keeps all of this work bottled up, and we don't really understand what those feelings are. We don't understand how to interpret them. We don't understand how to work with them. We don't understand how to just be with them.
Mhm.
And when we are with them, we realize they're not as frightening as we thought they were. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And you get to witness them, you get to experience them. And I can just say for myself, I know many people who've listened to this show, I'm sure you've heard me say it. This was a whole new realm for me to explore in the last 10, 12 years. I was a very heady individual, was that way for much of my life. And we don't need to get into the backstory of what had created that. And it was a new idea. It was a new sensation to actually be in touch with my feelings. I know even one of the
Yeah.
practices you recommend is a body scan, to literally get back into our bodies and to feel what's there. It just a fundamentally important, almost like level setting process for us to go through.
Yeah. It is such a foundational piece. It really
So,
is.
so then if you could say more, and I know this starts to move us into the second chamber, how do we actually really truly separate and understand emotion separate from story?
Yeah, it can take a while because they're often so boop, like totally connected. But what you want to do is you're feeling your body, and like, I'm feeling this way because it's like, no, sweetie, what are you
Mhm.
feeling? Just breathe into
Mhm.
that. And you'll see your mind will try and hook you back. Well, of course I feel this way. They did this. It's like, stop, come back to just the feeling. So
Mm.
it's that place of unhooking from the story, coming back to your body. And so for some people, it really helps to put your hands where you feel the sensation. And also for those of us, like I was the same way, I really repressed my emotions for many years. And it never works well. Like it seems like it's working well, but in the long run, it's not sustainable. And so if you're a person that has a story that I shouldn't have emotions, or there's too
Mhm.
many emotions, or it's too intense, or I'm spiritual, I should always, like, whatever the story is,
Yeah.
to push that story aside, to say, thank you so much. I want to go back into a relationship with my emotional body and see what's here. And what
Mm.
you're doing is basically courting your emotional body again.
Mm.
Because often there's this disconnect. Your emotional body doesn't trust you anymore because you've been ignoring. It's like a kid that you've been ignoring, and suddenly you're like, hey, now I want to get to know you. And they're like, I don't know about you. Like, you've been mean to me for the last 400 years or whatever. So you want to be patient and just open and say, I'm here. I want to know what I feel. And eventually it may take a little bit of time, but that your emotional body will start trusting you, and it'll start showing up.
Mhm.
And then you can start cleaning the backlog.
Mm.
So the places, I think about it as this backpack. So many of us have these huge backpacks of the past, of all the things we haven't known what to do with. And so what we're learning to do is take the backpack off, set it down, start to empty it out. And then your emotional body, the relationship with your emotional body changes so drastically once you've cleared it. It just becomes this beautiful antenna of, oh, something's off. And you know immediately, and you can adjust.
So, two things. One is for everybody listening in, as soon as the mind starts to attach I'm feeling this, but because, justifying the feeling,
Yes.
rationalizing, and as soon as the mind engages in that, as opposed to literally just noticing what the feeling and labeling, if you need to, the feeling that's there, as soon as it goes further, you're kicking off into story mode. And exactly as HeatherAsh you just walked us through, of how that's okay, we'll get to that. Let's just stay here with the feeling, with the sensation that's there. And I think the second thing that you highlighted there just at the end, just kind of is, kind of the little carrot that we can wave out there for everybody. Your body's become such incredible antennas, radars
Mhm.
for what's going on. And your body will signal and give you so much wisdom you can't even imagine.
Yeah.
But we have to start listening to it. And we have to clear it and to be able to tune into it. So that does move us into that second chamber then of story. And I guess maybe here it's more about, my question is more about, how do we, it's almost like when you're an actor in a movie, how do you know that you're in the movie and you're just an actor and not actually living it, right? If we're in the story, how do we recognize that it's just a story?
At the story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The first is to be willing to just look and listen and pay attention to what is happening in your mind. What are you saying to yourself? And to not edit it, to not try and make it better, to not spiritualize it, which we sometimes do, but to really put your absolute focus on what am I thinking about this situation. So whatever is upset you, whatever place you feel like you're off, you then turn your attention to what's the thoughts. And what you'll see pretty quickly is the story that you're telling yourself about the feeling or about the situation. And what I tell people is you're learning to become a witness. You're learning to become aware of what's going on in your head. And that means the judgment, the victimization, the blame, like everything that's there, let it come up unedited.
Mm-hmm.
and look at the content.
And the image I've sometimes used, and I even got this image in my head as I was reading some of this, is it's almost that, you know, when you're entering into the story chamber, it's almost as if you're casting your thoughts up onto a movie screen while you stay in the seat in the audience, right? So that you can start to recognize and see in front of you the movie that's playing out. And then you don't need to be the character in the movie. You can watch your character going through it. And, you know, that idea, and I'm trying to give an image because that idea of stepping into being a witness is one you hear very often in a lot of these types of traditions, and is a very important observer role to gain that objectivity back within your life, and yet really challenging to learn.
Yes,
right.
It is.
It was a practice that you mentioned. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more. It was a practice you mentioned in the book around organizing your stories. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because there's something in there that I recognized as incredibly powerful. But I'll elaborate on that after you kind of talk us through here.
Yeah, after you do the practice for a while, what happens is you start to recognize that your stories have themes. Yeah. That we tend to have themes in our storylines. And when you're working with the story, you don't want to just find the first level and think I'm done. You know, like if you're an archaeologist, you wouldn't pick up a shard from the surface and go, excellent, we're done here. You would keep digging. And it's the same thing with your stories. There's layers of your stories. And so this idea of organizing it is that as you work through the process over and over again, and you can literally journal, you can create bubbles, you can start being creative of what are the main themes of the stories that I tell myself. And you can also start watching yourself as you move in the world. And then you can start to organize them of like, okay, there's the theme that has to do with being, I'm just going to make stuff up. This is not my experience. Maybe some of it might be, but my experience of being a younger sister and what that, you know, with all boys as older, you know, and what that created inside of me, what story that created. There's also the experience of getting kicked out of university. So you start to look at where the storylines are and what you did with the experiences. Because we all have experiences, what we did with the experience. What did we tell ourselves about the experience? That's what's unique about each of us, is we can have the same experience and two people can have completely different stories about it. Yeah. So what's your story about those experiences that happened?
And that's where it's what this begins to do. And you know, I know you encourage journaling throughout the course of the book. I encourage journaling extensively with the work I do as well, because you begin to see the patterns that start to emerge. And then you can start to recognize, okay, you know what? These 2 or 3 patterns are really prevalent in what's going on in my life right now. But now you're working at the core, at the root of what's actually going on here, as opposed to, exactly as you said, staying at the surface level and just stopping with the first little thing that you find. And, you know, when you can see those patterns, and then all of a sudden you can see 2 completely different, you know, situations in your life that you think have no relation to each other whatsoever, and they're the exact same story. They're the same pattern, right? It's there.
It's so true.
And so it's really, really helpful to be able to walk through that type of process. And then that brings us to kind of that third chamber of the truth chamber. And I was wondering if you could talk us through this, because this to me is you know, again, another very kind of difficult, deepening step to be able to recognize what's really the truth of what's going on to separate that from the story.
Yeah, it is so important. And I'll add one thing about the story chamber, and this
Please.
is a truth, is that one of the things that we often tell ourselves is, I should be done with that story. And this is why people don't actually create change often, because the truth is we do have very few storylines. When you get down to the core, it tends to be one or two things. And then we get super creative on top of that. But for most of us, there's some core stories, and we get frustrated because we're like, I should be done with this. I shouldn't be. And so we create a lot more suffering with ourselves instead of just going, yep, there's my core story. Hey, sweetheart, we're back. So moving from the story chamber to the truth chamber, what most of us do is we step into the truth chamber, we write a better story, and we call it the truth. And so what we have to learn to do is really ascertain the difference between story and truth. And there's many ways, but two of the main ways that I've found to do that is, one, you already know the truth. Your being already knows the truth. So when you find a truth, there'll be this resonance, this relaxation, this opening in the body. And it's different than a story that you're like, this is familiar, because there's a little bit more of or a defensive, or I have to make sure this is right. With the truth, there's no, I have to explain. There's just like, yep. And you might not even like the truth, but you recognize it as true. So you want to start to learn that, what does it feel like in my body when I'm speaking truth? The second is that the truth is incredibly simple. It's one sentence. And the moment that you have a comma or a semicolon and you're now defending it or explaining it, you're back in story. So to really let yourself practice, what do I know is true here? And that is going to be one sentence with a period at the end.
Yeah. And, I think what you also recognize is that in the simplicity of that statement, that sentence that comes out, there is no judgment in that sentence, right? There's nothing that is labeled as good or bad or right or wrong or good and evil. It's not that. It just is, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I also love that sense of tuning into our body with truth. Another reason why getting in touch with kind of our feelings and the body sensations is so critical is you begin to distinguish between, even if you clarify, even if you think it's simple, you'll be able to distinguish as to whether you're just feeling better, meaning like, okay, I feel okay now, I feel better now. That's not truth. Right? That's just a really, really effective rationalization.
Yeah. It's all fine.
Right? It's all fine. It's something
great.
that's much more deeply resonant in our bodies. It literally is something you feel and experience. So with that, we then begin to move into this fourth chamber of intent. And if you could distinguish a little bit about this chamber of intent and how it's different than the desire or wish for something to be different. There's a very different commitment that's being made here.
Yeah, the intent is one word, and it's your focus. It's where you will commit to putting your energy. Doesn't mean you know how to do it. It means that you're willing to try, you're willing to practice. So it's really, for me, this is really the most warrior of the process, is getting clear on, this is my intent. And your intent is not, I want the situation to be different, this person needs to be different. If they were more present and compassionate, then I would feel better. No, your intent is, I'm going to commit to being compassionate in this situation, or my intent is presence, or my intent is play and bringing more joy in. So your intent can be anything, but it's something that you feel in your body as well. So, and it changes how you then navigate going forward. How you bring the warrior heart practice into your life is going to be based on what intent you pick.
It's a certain personal responsibility that you're taking on, right? It's not that, as you said, I want this person, this situation to be different. It's a recognition of, well, I can't actually change people that are outside of me, but I can focus, I can draw my attention on the quality that I choose to bring forward and the quality that I believe will most contribute to the experience that I wish to have, or what I wish to bring forward. And I also know that, from connecting to your book, I think one of the really critical aspects of this also was that you're doing it unconditionally. right? You're not saying,
Mhm.
I'll do this if. You're not bargaining here.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Right? It's owning your space and
Mhm.
saying, here is how I am going to bring this forward. And just it's taking ownership over that path.
Absolutely.
I guess the last piece to bring us, kind of full round and begin to wrap up is, and everybody listening, the process is a bit more involved. We've described the pieces of it. The process is a bit more involved to be able to navigate through. So I really want to encourage you to check out the Warrior Heart, and dive into this. But I want to talk a little bit about now just that integration piece, because I think so many of us are familiar with the book that we love, the process we love, the seminar we attended, and then we go back into regular life, and we go from where we thought we'd be to sliding back. How do we go from this incredible type of process and navigation and inquiry to really beginning to manifest it, to bring it forward in how we're showing up in life?
Yes. And it's, again, this is a really critical piece of the integration. And for me, this work is about how do I use the challenges in my life to grow me, to help me become more compassionate, stronger, more present, whatever it is that I want more of my life. And so doing this practice, we're not doing it thinking, okay, I'll have less challenges in my life. We're doing it to go, okay, there's going to be challenges, but now I know how to navigate them. So when you go back, when you circle back through the process, you're taking your intent, whatever that word is that you chose, stepping back into the truth chamber, getting clear, renaming what your truth is, and there may be more than one, holding hands with those, and then stepping back into the story chamber to look with new eyes through your intent and through the truth at the story. And how can you perceive the story differently? How can you use this story to really benefit you, to really grow you? And then you always end in the feeling chamber. So what am I feeling now? And ending the feeling chamber doesn't mean you did it right if you feel good and you did it wrong if you don't feel good. Sometimes we realize, oh, I have a lot of grief that I have to work through, or I still feel disappointed. And what I've seen is if you listen and hold that, you'll know how to start to clear. You'll be more in touch with the emotional body again. So going back then, when you go into the situation, because it's not like you do this process and the situation completely disappears. That'd be lovely. Can't guarantee it, but it's now you are going through with intent. You're like, all right, I know what my purpose is. I know what I'm here to do. And let me go practice. Let me try. Let me bring my intent and the truth into the situation and change my relationship to it. The situation may not change, but your relation to it can deeply change.
Yeah. And that in and of itself, when the way you relate to situations, to specific individuals in your life, to any number of things you can relate to inside of your life, you'll see that over time, the cumulative impact of that, of showing up that way, relating differently, those individuals may not change, but the way that your life looks, the types of situations that get created from that point forward will start to change.
Yes.
And if you
Yes.
watch that and you take even some, of that reflective practice to observe and be grateful for the progress that's being made or the changes that are unfolding, even if they don't look exactly like you'd expect them to, you will start to see the progress. You'll start to see the shift, the changes that are occurring. And I love the fact that, your process is kind of the front, front and then forward and then back again, in that sense of it does kind of bring the past forward to the present, meaning how it is we walk through the emotions and the story of it, the truth of it. It brings it into the present moment. And then we're allowing the future to actually become present as well as we walk back through it. So when we integrate all of that, we can be more present when those times of challenge, those times of struggle, those times that we're working through are now being presented to us. We've experienced it. And it gives us a different starting point to be able to work through those.
Yeah, so true.
HeatherAsh, I guess the kind of just to wrap us up, I guess just my last question to you would simply be in, all of this work, everything that you've been able to accomplish and in seeing this, I guess I would just ask, how is life different for you today than even it was 60 years ago when you began writing this book before you produced it?
Oh my gosh. It's one thing is I've so fallen in love with truth.
Mm.
Like before, I used to be like more attached to my stories and like hold on to them for a lot longer. And now I'm just like, okay, what's true? Even if I don't like it, even if it hurts, I'm like, I want to know what's true here, so I can then make the next choice from a place of clarity. And it's just simplified my life so beautifully, and I have a ton more spaciousness in my life. I'm really um, just joyful most of the time.
Yeah.
And I know the challenges are going to come up, and I'm like, bring it on, because that's life.
Absolutely. HeatherAsh, I want to thank you so much for being here on One Idea Way, for sharing your work with us, your message with us, your energy with us, your wisdom with us, and just for the work you're doing in the world right now.
Thanks so much. Great to be here with you.
Thank you. For everybody, I guess I would actually just echo where HeatherAsh was explaining. There is a certain beauty to be found and a certain joy to be found in the truth, whatever that truth happens to be. At times it's going to be tough to face. At times it's going to have us look deep within ourselves and say, yeah, I'm actually not showing up the way that I want to, or I am much more responsible for where I'm at at this particular moment in time. It's not always an easy thing to do. It can be a challenging thing to do. And yet it is also the most liberating thing that you can do. And it's in that liberation that you find the reconnection to the part of yourself that is truest. That big soul, as we talked about today, we can call it the essential self, the true self, whatever you want to describe it as. But that's what we're looking to reconnect to. We want things that are really based off of truth, because that's where our alignment comes from. That's where our congruence comes from. And when we bring that into our life, when we bring that into our relationships, we bring that into our work, it becomes much more about how we're living and the energy that we bring to it than the specific details that happen to be there. The details are just fun to play with at that point. So I encourage you to, enjoy and follow this journey towards truth, to check out HeatherAsh's work and the Warrior Heart, as well as I thank you as always for tuning in to One Idea Away. And until next time, continue to enjoy the journey. Thank you. Check out IPEC's coach training program at ipeccoaching.com/OIA. And of course, to find out about all the conversations, events, gatherings, all the things that we've got upcoming, then head on over to oneideaaway.com/community. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do us the favor of subscribing, reviewing the show, as well as sharing insights or comments that stood out for you in this episode.